Good evening, everyone. I'm Satish Shariga from Kasturba Medical College, Manipal, moderator of today's panel discussion. We are privileged to have such an august gathering of phenomenal panelists with the vast experience and scientific knowledge with us this evening. And I'm honored to welcome our panelists and attendees across the globe to this panel discussion on choosing the right sperm to enhance the ART outcome. This webinar is being organized by SAR Healthline, which is well known to all of us. They have been helping us in all our embryology requirements and also promoting science through various activities. To briefly introduce the topic, in the next 30 minutes, we'll be discussing about some of the key issues related to the diagnostic as well as therapeutic aspects in andrology. Initially, we would like to focus on one of the fundamental aspects of male gamete, then move on to technical issues, and then finally we'll discuss about some of the advanced aspects of andrology. To be very specific, some of the advanced sperm selection techniques which are being used in andrology. And I hope you will enjoy the discussion. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to post your questions in Q&A box, which we can take them up for discussion at the end of the session. As I mentioned earlier, our panelists have unique takes on this webinar, in this panel discussion, because we have fundamental biologists, we have R&D scientists, we have clinical embryologists, we have lab directors, we have entrepreneurs. So I'm sure they are very happy to share their knowledge in this field. So before we start, it's my pleasure to introduce our panelists to you in alphabetical order. Dr. Arun Kumar Radhakrishnan. Dr. Arun Kumar is an embryologist trained in Singapore, and currently he is working as a scientist and at SAR Healthline Research Unit, Chennai, India. And his areas of expertise includes the technology development, especially into aspects of cryopreservation and microfluidics. He is fond of simplifying the technology, especially developing rapid use technique test for andrology diagnostics, and I'm sure you will hear from him later. We have Dr. Nitish Modia. Dr. Nitish Modia is the lab director at Indira IVF Hospital Private Limited, which is the largest chain of IVF centers in the country. And his areas of expertise include the lab management at multi-centric level. They have more than 100 centers in the country. It's a very unique expertise in the lab management at a multi-centric level. And his interests are also at the protocol optimization, implementing new technology, and quality control and KPI optimization. We have Dr. Raul Da Costa. Dr. Raul is a scientist at the Center for Reproductive Medicine and Andrology at the University of Munster. The center is very famous because this center has contributed significantly to the development of WHO manual, which we have been referring today, when Dr. Trevor Cooper was in the center. And currently, the center is headed by another pioneer, Professor Stefan Slack. And Dr. Da Costa is a fundamental biologist and has done a lot of work in the field of sperm. And his areas of expertise include sperm physiology, membrane architecture, DNA integrity, and currently he is into developing non-invasive technology for sperm selection. Dr. Sujata. Dr. Sujata is one of the senior embryologists in the country, has more than 25 years of experience, both national and international level, and she's the American board certified embryology lab director. I guess she's the only the board certified embryologist in the country, and she is the scientific director at the Cloud9 Fertility India, and her areas of expertise includes embryology and ART lab. Okay, now let's start the discussion. Most of us believe that it's easy to handle sperm in the lab because the sperm are produced in millions, and we need hardly few sperm for injection or for insemination. But if you look at that techniques which are recommended for either for semen analysis or for the selection of sperm, they are very simple. One can easily master these techniques. But what is important here is that the most of the sperm are not functionally competent to establish pregnancy. In addition to that, we also know that there are no non-invasive, non-destructive technique to select normal sperm. And unlike embryos or oocytes, we don't have any metabolomic or transcriptomic markers for sperm selection. These are some of the challenges in evaluating the sperm competence. And it's very important to know. And I guess Dr. Rahul is the right person who has thoroughly understood the physiology and biochemistry of sperm biology. Probably he's the right person to address this challenges in evaluating sperm competence. Because Dr. Rahul, what is so unique about human sperm and why we still have difficulties in evaluating sperm competence? Dr. Rahul.
Yes, Dr. Satish, thanks a lot for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure for me. Indeed, yes, sperm evaluation is not an easy task. If we take, for example, in consideration a normal ejaculate, it consists of millions of spermatozoa, although only a fraction is actually competent. And of course, these spermatozoa are uh, comes with limited resources, so it depends on the um, experience of the embryologist to select the tools and finally to select the sperm, which it would be defined as the most competent one. But what does this really mean? Um, Structurally, the spermatozoa seems to be simple cell. However, if we want to define what is a viable spermatozoa, it's necessary to take in consideration many factors. And in this way, it can only be defined since, from my point of view, in a biochemical or physiological way. To reach the sperm and to fertilize it, the sperm to reach the egg and fertilize the egg, the spermatozoa has to react to many complex situations, including physical changes in the tract, in the feminine genital tract, for example, changes of molarity, pH, temperature, viscosity. It has to react to all the signaling molecules that the eggs release, and of course all these comes into an interplay of different factors that involve membrane dynamics, redox process, signaling pathways, and also the nuclear consistency. um, at the moment the embryologists are limited for what they can see, so they are limited by cytological characteristics, and this is why it's so complex to define what is the best sperm to select to for art procedures.
Yeah, I totally agree with you because it's not easy as the sperm looks. It is so small and simple, but it is very complex in terms of it's a physiological as well as biochemical process. But what is interesting is with all this complication, with all this complex situation, WHO has been doing a wonderful job. It has been helping us by refining the analytical methods. It has been helping us by providing the reference range, reference value for semen analysis, which is really helping us in the diagnosis of the male infertility. So my question to Dr. Arun, with reference to the current WHO recommendations, how do you define a good sperm? Dr. Arun.
Well, a normal sperm can be defined on the basis of its structural and functional integrity. So, for this, the sperm should have inherent ability to survive in the female reproductive tract. And for this, a good measure of progressive motile sperms are absolutely important. And moreover, the mitochondrial machinery should be really good to produce sufficient amount of ATP molecules to start sustain its kinetic properties. And morphology is really important as it is correlated with the sperm binding ability to zona pellucida. And acrosomal configuration, it is very important to induce acrosome reaction as it is a prerequisite for oocyte fusion. And the sperm should be free from ultrastructural anomalies, and vacuoles from the nucleus, it shouldn't be there. Last but not the least, the integrity of the sperm DNA has been recognized as an important factor for successful reproductive outcomes. So the sperm chromatin should be really good to create a healthy and viable embryo. So ultimately, a comprehensive semensis provides essential information on the sperm fertilizing ability of a sperm and the purpose of male evaluation with respect to semensis in any ART treatment is just to maximize the sperm quality. Regarding the current WHO Manual 2010, it is evidence-based and they have done remarkable developments and it's better than the previous editions. And to establish the cutoff values, the WHO worked on data involving 1,053 semen samples with a time-to-time pregnancy of less than 12 months. Of course, there are some controversies, criticisms on the classification of progressive motility and morphology. And the classification of progressive motility into fast and slow is rejected because of the technician inability to distinguish between the two. And of course, it will allow more objective evaluation rather being subjective. And regarding morphology, several studies have proved that the cutoff values really correlate with the pregnancy rates, and it is in close agreement with the WHO reference values. But paradoxically, the WHO standards or the procedures are not implemented in many locations because of the very poor quality control measures. So I feel quality control is very important that every laboratory should follow to ensure reliable clinical results.
Yeah, because as you said, the WHO reference range is also the criteria every lab uses for the diagnosis of the male infertility. But always we should remember that these WHO reference values are attached to a disclaimer. That means if everything is normal or above the reference range, doesn't mean that the person is fertile or vice versa. Yeah. So I wanted to know from Dr. Sujatha, your experience, what is the correlation between the semen analysis or the semen value as per the WHO and embryological outcome with respect to fertilization or the clinical outcome? Do you see any correlation?
Okay. See, semen analysis is more of a descriptive in nature. Okay, it doesn't actually tell us about the fertilization ability of a sperm. And if we are defining a good sperm, it's not only the morphology, but it also should have the ability to fertilize the sperm. And it doesn't end there. It also should contribute to the early embryonic development and resulting in implantation, and it should continue to be a live birth. So all this cannot be assessed only by the WHO criteria alone. You need to have advanced tests like DNA fragmentation test along with the WHO criteria to correlate it to the clinical values. But otherwise, if you are just looking at motility and morphology, they say motility is a better parameter to predict outcome post IVF compared to morphology in this era of ICSI.
All right. So as you said, one of the limitations or one of the important limitations of conventional semen analysis is cannot address the nuclear integrity, because these days we see a lot of so much of concern about the sperm DNA fragmentation and its impact on the reproductive outcome. But what is important here is that the sperm carrying DNA damage still has the ability to fertilize outside. That is the biggest problem. And there are several meta-analyses, there are several RCTs which are showing, which have established a correlation between the high DFI and incidence of miscarriage. So that is really an important issue which one should think about it. And the question here is again to Dr. Raul, because you have been working in this direction for a long time. With all this, sperm DNA testing is why it is not being considered routinely like a semen analysis, and why we are not able to establish a correlation between the diagnostic and prognostic value of sperm DNA damage in clinical practice.
Yes, those are two very nice questions. For the first one, yes, I mean, based on those concerns.
Is it due to again the uniqueness of sperm structure?
Sorry again?
Is it due to the unique structural or unique structure of the sperm?
In part, Yes, but I would say that there are different things to consider also. For example, it is known that DNA damage is, as you mentioned, it's prevalent among infertile men, and there is a negative correlation between fertilization, embryo development, implantation, and pregnancies. But I think that in this case, one of the issues is that there is no reference limit method to evaluate DNA damage. There are a lot of methods that you could use, and there is not one standardized method that it's recommended to use. So there are a lot of values, not only of threshold values, but also different results that have to take in consideration and are a little bit conflicted. You also have to take in consideration that the different methods of evaluation of DNA damage, they consist in different uh, principles. So it can be like the incorporation of metachromatic dyes, for example, in the case of the sperm chromatin structured aside, or the integration of labeled nucleotides, for example, in tuna, or the differential movement or dispersion of the DNA. But these, depending on the method, you will know information about how damaged is the DNA and how susceptible is the DNA to be damaged. And this goes, as you said, to the structure of the DNA inside of the head. Um, is inside of the sperm nucleus, the DNA is exposed in an almost crystalline way. So it's very difficult to access to, to the DNA to evaluate it. So all these methods try with different principles to evaluate how it is, what's the state, and of course, at the end, it's difficult to compare among them. And in this case, the WHO, what they do is just to put these evaluation methods more into the research side and not for diagnostic. And this is why it's not considered in the routine analysis. In the case of the second question,
Yeah,
if
why why we are not able to establish a correlation between the, of course, you have partially answered to this question. Because of the technical complexity and technique to technique variation, there are difficulties. I do agree with you. But even with all these limitations, we still perform DNA fragmentation analysis, at least in the ART cycles. And
yes,
but we also know that there are several factors which can influence the DNA fragmentation, such as the patient. It could be patient related, or it could be even the duration of abstinence can also have some impact on the DNA fragmentation. There could be ejaculate to ejaculate variation. So in this situation, I request Dr. Sujata to tell us what are your recommendations when actually this DNA fragmentation test to be done? Is it during the analysis or during the prior on the day of procedure? Whether to do it in a neat ejaculate or whether to do it in the process fraction? What is your opinion about this, Dr. Pujara?
Dr. Satish, to continue from where Dr. Raul left, so you were asking why is it not performed regularly, isn't it? Like
Yes,
uh,
yes.
the main reason is sperm is a heterogeneous sample. I think that is the main reason why what happens is like if DNA fragmentation is affected, not all the sperm in the ejaculate is affected. You still have some normal sperm and still you can get pregnancy. So that is the reason I think it becomes very difficult to correlate the level of DNA fragmentation to the clinical parameters. Now, having established, like there are a lot of studies, though they are only C and B grade evidence, which is based on small studies, not randomized controlled trials. It has been correlated that DNA fragmentation is associated with time to conception, to several cycles of failed IVF, missed abortion, and mainly these three conditions. Now, when do we do DNA fragmentation test? Now, there is no evidence to suggest that you have to do it on the first visit. Normally, what is done is, like in the case of unexplained infertility, or in the case of repeated IUI failure, or in the case of repeated IVF or ICSI failure, DNA fragmentation is suggested because that is what is normally done at present because of the lack of evidence to start it as a first line of diagnostic test. When do we test it? It is better to test it along with semen analysis because we know that DNA fragmentation can be due to several factors. Some of them are, innate factors. Some of them are due to modifiable lifestyle risk factor. So if it is due to some modifiable factor, it actually gives a chance for the patient to change those conditions so that they'll have reduced DNA fragmentation in the semen sample. So it is better to do DNA fragmentation along with semen analysis. And then whether we do it on a neat ejaculate or a processed fraction was the next question. It is advised to do DNA fragmentation test in a neat ejaculate. The reason being, sperm processing, especially centrifugation, by itself is known to cause DNA fragmentation. So actually, then whatever the result we get, it would be a false positive. Hence, it is always advisable to do DNA fragmentation test on a neat ejaculate.
Okay, so you have opinion that the test should be done in the neat ejaculate and also during the day of semen analysis. Okay, but the question now here is that the availability of the facility, as there are several techniques are available for the DNA fragmentation. Some of them are very simple, the rapid test, or some needs very expensive equipment. For example, if you want to go for ACCA, which costs not less than 5 million rupees. It's very expensive, or even a fluorescent microscope. So there are technical complexity, and again, the clinical value of the data is really questioned. Now, I asked this question to Dr. Nitish Modia because he has set up more than 100 centers in his company, and he's the right person to address. Is there any way we can go for a complete andrology setting labs in a limited resource setting? What is the feasibility of having a complete andrology facility, a limited resource setting, Dr. Modia?
Thank you, Dr. Adiga, for a nice introduction. As Dr. Sujata, Dr. Arun, and Dr. Rahul, as my other panelist friend has talked about the sperms and how complex is semen analysis shaping up in the near future, and the whole world is looking at sperms with more cautious compared to how it used to be with the eggs. So a basic setup for andrology should have a microscope, a bright field microscope, which should have objectives like 10x, 20x, 40x, and 100x. They should have a centrifuge where they can process the sperm. They should have a warmer or a 37-degree bacteriological incubator to keep the samples at 37 degrees centigrade. And of course, to do a semen analysis, you should have a macular chamber available. So this is a basic configuration which any andrology lab should have. And based on the technical expertise of the andrology technician, you can have a bit of advanced testing also available. And if you don't have the resources, or if you don't have the technical capability to do these advanced tests, there are few tests which are readily available, which is the morphological, which is the slides which are available where you can just put the sperm. So there are a few more testings which you can do for the sperm, which is number one is the morphological testing, number two is the leukocyte, number three is the vitality, and as other panelists are talking about the DNA, so there is DFI which you can do. There are some of these which are readily available, some of these which you have to prepare it, and it requires some skill level. So what we have tried to do is mention all these four different types of tests, and classify these tests into, what is the technical feasibility, what is the sensitivity, and what is the financial implication, just to give a fair idea in terms of if a center is coming up and wants to establish an embryology lab, what they can look at. So if we look at morphology, there are two different types. One is the gold standard, which is the diff-quick staining, and the second is the pre-stained slides, which are available. So if you look at the technical feasibility, the diff-quick is easy to perform. It's a quick staining, but it requires a bit of skill level of the technician. There are risk of increased VOC because we are using that stain. Compared to that, if you look at the pre-stained slides, they are very easy to use. You will need minimum skill. You just put your sample on a pre-prepared slide. There is no risk of VOC. If you talk about sensitivity and specificity, in terms of diff-quick staining, we normally count around 200 sperm in this particular type of testing. It is a liquid-based thing. The reproducibility is a bit limited because again it depends on the user. It depends on the technician who's doing the staining. So there is limited reproducibility, and of course this test is user dependent. And if you talk about the pre-stained slides, it is quite standard, and the results are reproducible. Both of them are cost effective. Of course, the pre-stained slides are slightly costlier than the diff-quick staining. And in terms of the skill level, you don't require too high skill level when you're doing it with the pre-stained slides. Leukocytes, again, it is easy to perform and it's a quick staining. But again, it requires a bit of skill level for the technician to do it. Again, in this, it's a liquid staining which is required, and reproducibility is again limited to the user or limited to the technician who's doing it, of course, and it is cost effective. Now, when we come to vitality, uh, uh, which is differentiating between the dead and the live sperms, you have these structural dye integrity tests. So again, it is a staining which you need to perform. It requires a bit of skill level for the technician who's doing it, and a bit of variation of this is the HOS test that we do for the functional integrity. In case if you have a sample where there is non-motile sperm, so you can do perform this HOS test. It doesn't involve any staining to be performed, and your sperms which are usable would have a tail curl. There are other methods to detect with the use of laser also, and with the use of touching of the ICSI pipette to determine which sperm is live. But this test is a very good test, which is the HOS test to analyze which sperms are live. The fourth one and the final one is the sperm DNA fragmentation, which is the sperm chromative dispersion assay. It's again it's a relative simple thing. You require lesser skill of the user or the technician, and again you count around 200 sperm. It has good reproducibility, and it is least expensive. Dr. Adiga, just like to add two more things to
Yeah,
Dr. Sujata. Uh,
yeah.
I think it's a matter of concern or question for all the clinicians, especially when it comes to which patients should you select to do a DNA analysis, right? It shouldn't be all patients doing a DNA analysis. I think that would be the perfect case scenario. But then looking at the condition and the load of the clinic, sometimes it becomes very difficult to do a DNA analysis of each and every patient. So as Dr. Sujata rightly mentioned that potential candidates for these DNA tests are patients who have failed multiple IUIs, or patients who have unexplained infertility, or patients who have miscarriage, or patients who have previously failed IVF. But there has been a few studies done by Sandro Steves and Dr. Ashok Agarwal, where they have also mentioned two more category of patients, First category being the obese patient, they are also a good candidate to do a DNA fragmentation before we go for any treatment. And second is the patient who are using few drugs like those steroid drugs or antihypertensive or other kind of drugs which are being used. They are also a potential candidate to do this DNA analysis.
Okay. So thank you very much, Dr. Modia. Now I ask a question to Dr. Arun. You are involved in the development of, you are actively involved in the development of the rapid test, is your favorite area. And what is your recommendation about the application of or establishing the technique in the lab? Whether our technicians or embryologists need to take any precautions?
Yes, actually, as Dr. Nitish said, the pre-stain slides is really simple to use actually. When we use dipstick staining, where liquids are used, it's a liquid staining. Basically, when you do the fixation where methanol is used, and there's a chance where the VOC can be liberated. So I feel that pre-stain slides to detect sperm morphology, it's a good choice where it is reproducible and any lab technician can perform it. It is reliable
Okay.
and comparable with conventional staining methods. And here I would like to add one more point that regarding Hoss test, there are reports that say it can yield false positive reactions. So it can be used as an additional indicator for sperm vitality and to detect immotacea syndrome. As Dr. Nitish said, to perform ICSI procedure to select the viable sperm for ICSI microinjection.
All right. So have you tested the sensitivity of your techniques with the standard, the conventional test?
Yes, there are some reports that says by work done by Sandro Estives, it says that the DNA sperm chromatin dispersion test, which is now done by all the labs, it's comparable with the tunnel SCSA and common assay.
Okay. I think at this moment I would like to ask Dr. Raul because Dr. Raul, I remember one of your paper earlier, even in the minute aspect, even during the preparation of the slide for DNA fragmentation analysis, even fixation can cause DNA fragmentation, if I vaguely remember. So what is your view on this aspect?
Again, can you tell me the question again?
No, because one of your papers, when I was reading it, and which states that there are even technical issues because even a simple fixation of the sperm can cause DNA damage. So we need to be extremely careful even while preparing the slide for DNA fragmentation. What is your opinion about this?
Yes, DNA damage is one of the results of many stimuli that we induce in the spermatozoa while we treat them. It can be triggered by mechanical stimuli or something that can just trigger a redox response in the sperm and the production of oxygen radicals. It would lead into DNA fragmentation. So it's something that it's very important to have in mind when we are selecting the tools and the techniques that we want to use to process the seminal sample, because at the end, inducing redox responses in the sperm is very easy. Can be induced by basically anything in the lab, and the idea is to how to minimize all these intervention, and of course this will also make them at the end more accessible to everybody in the lab if you have less step of processing.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to the extraction of sperm for therapeutic insemination in the lab. Because when we perform sperm isolation extraction by various techniques in andrology lab, the results are not as we expect. Maybe because of the patient-related factors, or could be due to the quality of the ejaculate. I request Dr. Sujata to please elaborate on the patient-specific factors which can influence the quality of sperm.
Okay, see, when you're talking about the patient-specific factors, we have to look at the quality of the semen sample itself. We know that there are two very well validated techniques of sperm preparation. like the migration techniques and the density gradient centrifugation techniques. Now, these two are very well established techniques, but they are actually good for certain selective sperm characteristics. For example, if you are using a migration technique, the concentration has to be good, the motility has to be good. When you are using density gradient centrifugation technique, then like you should not have lot of debris in the semen sample. So all these characteristics of semen sample actually would influence your post sperm preparation quality.
Okay. All right, Dr. Nitish, would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the pathology and the collection, I think you, first of all, when you talk about pathology, um, a center or a clinic should take a detailed medical history of the patient if he has any varicocele or any trauma in the testes. The collection of the sample should be properly explained to the patient. Especially when it comes to abstinence, which should be 2 to 7 days. We should explain them the sterile technique. We should explain them, the complete collection of the sample. The jar given to them should have a wide mouth so that there is no spill. And if there is any spill that happens of the sample, the patient should inform the clinic or the embryologist, and then probably a resample can be done after the abstinence time. The sample collection facility should be available in the clinic, and the preferable way would be a sample collected in the clinic. But of course, there will be some patients who might have concerns collecting the sample in the clinic. So if they want to do a home collection, they should be advised that the collected sample should be delivered to the hospital within 30 minutes. Otherwise, your semen analysis might be if effective because of the delay. And in terms of the role of embryologist, of course, embryologist would play a big role because at the end of the day, it is you who will be handling this sample, and you really know how much critical all these parameters are, which a patient would not know. Hence, making patient aware of a few aspects would really be important. Especially, the embryologist should be aware of the entire patient history, what problems he has. Is he being smoking? Is he being taking a few drugs? Or is he under stress? Or is he working in a hot environment? Embryologist should do a proper patient counseling. He should do a proper handling and the sample analysis in time. That is very important because delay in the time would change the semen analysis. Uh, there has been a lot of stress recently about samples being labeled. So if there is a witness system available in the lab, it would be a perfect thing to have. Or else you should have your methods to label the sample as well as the bottle. There should be proper SOPs which exist in the lab so that all the samples are handled as well as the analysis done in a proper standardized way. If a repeat semen analysis is required, proper instructions should be given to the patient so they can be called again to do a repeat semen analysis. And of course, if you're going for an ART procedure, you should consider a backup sample by freezing the semen sample just in case when the day comes and the patient is unable to produce semen ejaculate.
Okay, I think so. One important point we should always remember here is that the poor quality ejaculate tend to experience a kind of more adverse effect than normospermic sample, especially when the manipulation is done by the embryologist. And at this juncture, I would like to tell my embryologist colleagues that we have to be more careful while handling the poor quality ejaculate. As I mentioned, we tend to ignore sperm because earlier one of you have said that they are in millions, so we don't care because oocytes are very precious for us, but sperm we don't care because we need hardly few sperm for injection or insemination. So these days people are more concerned about the iatrogenic damage because we have more generic protocols rather than the ejaculate specific protocol. At this juncture, I would like Dr. Rahul initially to tell me about, from the cell biologist perspective, what are the problems one can anticipate if the techniques are not being followed in the andrology lab. And later, I request Dr. Sujata and Dr. Nitish to add your points from the embryologist perspective. Dr. Rahul.
Yes. As I mentioned it before, spermatozoa are susceptible to different kind of stimuli in the framework of RART. And this susceptibility can be used whether to enhance the quality of the sample, or it can also make damage in the cells. So, as it was also mentioned previously, there are several techniques. It can be a simple washing, or it can be a swim up, a density gradient. But what is important to know is that all these methods have an impact in sperm quality, which of course it can be to enhance the quality, to improve the quality of the sample. And the idea is to enhance these benefits, and of course to reduce the amount of damage that we induce in the sample. From a biologist's point of view, I think it's necessary to see beyond what the effect of these preparation methods on regular seminal parameters, and we have to think a little bit more about what's going on physiologically, what is going on cellularly in terms of redox processes, signaling pathways. It's very important to know all this at the moment to select the best method to be used if we want to have a method that can really give us what's the best sperm to analyze. I also think that it's important that all these methods has to be evidence-based procedures. So that's why all this information is necessary. And I think the clinicians also have to have an idea and search constantly what's new, what's better. And because sometimes we tend to think what is working, it's already fine, we won't change it. But I think it's very important to be aware that constantly there might be new mediums, new techniques, or new procedures that we can implement, and this will have a good impact in the sample that we are processing.
Dr. Sujata.
See, before I answer this question, like I would like to add a point to our previous discussion on transportation of semen sample. See, generally what happens is we let the patient collect sample at the premises, at the hospital premises. But now because of this COVID, this is a COVID era, and there is a recommendation that you can ask the patient to do off-site sperm collection. This is to, like to do this, to encourage social distancing and not to let the patient crowd in the hospital. There is a recommendation that if it is possible, you can ask the patient to collect it from home. So in these cases, it becomes very important that we have to counsel the patient about the way by which they are bringing the sample to the laboratory. Samples actually should reach the laboratory within 1 hour of collection. Two, they should not be transported in extreme temperatures. It should not be at 37 degrees Celsius. They need not keep it in a thermos flask, nor do they have to keep it in an ice box. It should be transported at room temperature. So this information has to be given, because otherwise that will have a very significant impact on the sperm quality. Now, moving on to this particular point of discussion on the iatrogenic damage, which is actually caused in the lab. First one is centrifugation. See, we cannot generally say that centrifugation by itself is dangerous to sperm sample. What actually makes it dangerous is the way in which the sample is handled. Centrifugation at a very high speed, that is speed greater than 800 G, is definitely harmful for sperm. And if you are processing a sample which has lot of RBCs or WBCs or any other cellular debris, or when there is increased number of immotile sperm, which can actually cause an increase in reactive oxygen species, in these conditions, centrifugation is bad. But otherwise, in a normal sample, in a very good sample, centrifugation is not harmful. That is something which we have to keep in mind. Second, in any protocol, like for example, if you are doing a density gradient centrifugation, it is recommended that you centrifuge the first time in two density gradient columns for 20 minutes. Either increasing or decreasing the time or increasing or decreasing the speed is not going to help. In fact, it is going to be more harmful. The reason why 20 minutes is recommended is you want the sperm to settle at its density gradient. At that particular, it is validated, and 20 minutes is the time it takes for the sample to get settled. So by decreasing it, or by increasing the time, or by decreasing the speed, or increasing the speed, you would be causing more damage to the sperm sample. Similarly, pipetting. Pipetting is also very important. You cannot handle sperm in a very rough way. And one thing is, when we have a viscous sample, it is usually they say for semen analysis, you can put it through a 22 gauge needle and run it up and down so that the viscosity is broken. But then if you are using the sample for any therapeutic purposes, it is not advised to put it through a 23 gauge needle. Instead, you have to dilute it with a little bit of media, let it be at 37 degrees Celsius for some time, and see if the viscosity is okay, or gently pipette it with a plastic pasture pipette and process the sample. So these handling techniques are extremely important, otherwise we are going to cause damage to the sperm structure.
Okay, Dr. Nitish, would you like to add anything to this?
Yeah, so I would just like to go back, to the times when IVF was invented, and the main reason for doing this ART procedure was to solve the female problems. Nobody considered male factor. So in those eras, it was normal media which was used for the sperm. In 1980s, people came up with density gradient using those beads, but again, it was to solve for unexplained type of patient. The male factor gained more importance after that era. But from last 30 years, we have still been using the same protocol of centrifugation. Now, let us look at nature, what nature does. In a natural process, what happens is your mucus in the cervix act as a barrier or a selector which allows which sperm should go inside the uterus, right? So we should, change methods. There have been a lot of development from last 10 years in this particular field, and we need to shift to, more closer to the nature. Now, talking about a roller coaster ride, if we sit in a roller coaster ride, you have a force of 5G acting on you, which is huge for you. Just imagine the sperm which has almost 500G acting on it. And if you talk about the sperm washing protocol, there might be 40 different protocols which exist worldwide, and really people are trying to play with what speed or what force they should use to spin your sperms and get the right optimum sperm. Of course, there has been. I wouldn't talk about the centrifugation correlation to the DNA because Dr. Sudhasa has already mentioned about it. But the kind of handling and the kind of time taken to process a semen sample, even if you're going for a density gradient or a normal swim up, is huge. And there may be a lot of spots in between these processing time when you are unable to maintain the temperature of the semen or the sperm in a particular media. Hence, it becomes very important for us to shift to a method which is less time consuming as well as less handling involved and more closer to nature.
Yeah, I think I agree with you. I think it's an important point you have raised, comparing the natural selection versus what we do in the Andorgy lab. I think that's an important, at the juncture, it's an important issue to look into, kind of going towards more towards the natural way of selecting the sperm. I think there are several techniques now which are available where we do not require centrifugation and which can also mimic the natural selection to some extent. I think the microfluidic is one of the, the technique which is gaining popularity these days. And now I request Dr. Arun to talk about this microfluidics and how it works and the technical aspects and how to perform sample using microfluidics technology. Dr. Arun, please.
Thank you. So microfluidics is relatively young, innovative, multifaceted technology. In recent years, it has become very popular in IVF industry. And when you look at physiology, three sperm guidance mechanisms have been proposed for a successful navigation through the female reproductive tract. One is thermotaxis, which is temperature dependent. Another one is chemotaxis, which is against the chemical gradient. And third one is rheotaxis. And it has been proved that rheotaxis plays a very important role in guiding the sperm towards the female reproductive tract. And this is very important. And this is also in natural sperm selection. The rheotaxis plays a very significant role. The sperm selection does not depend on its ability to bind to hyaluronic acid. So microfluidics technology also works on the rheotaxis, and let's take a deep look. So microfluidic technology involves some simple maths and physics. So fluid flow can be either at microscale or macro scale. At microscale, the flow will be laminar, whereas at macro scale, the flow will be turbulent. And flow either at micro scale or macro scale depends on some of the fluid characteristics such as viscosity, velocity, density, of course, the geometry and size of the channel collectively expresses Reynolds number. So Reynolds number is just a ratio of initial forces to viscous forces. If the viscous forces dominate, the flow will be laminar, and if the initial forces dominate, the flow will be turbulent. And so when the Reynolds number get reduced, the flow will be really laminar. So basically, microfluidic sorting technology works on hydrostatically driven laminar flow of sperm in microfluidic channels to sort the progressive motile sperm based on positive rheotaxis. The key separation principle is low Reynolds number. Now I think we will play a video to show the simple procedure. This is a microfluidic sorting chamber with 4 different channels interconnected by a microfluidic channel. The first step is we need to prepare the sperm sorting medium by mixing equal volume of sperm washing medium with the semen sample. So after that, it will be fixed on a 16 dish. The first step is all the chambers and the microfluidic channels should be rinsed with sperm washing media to increase the hydrophilicity and to prevent non-specific absorption of cells. So roughly 100 microliters will be dispensed in all the 4 chambers and it will be taken out. And finally, 20 microliters of sperm washing media will be placed in chamber C and D. 100 microliters in chamber B. And finally, 65 microliters of sperm suspension into chamber A. And this will be kept at 30 degrees centigrade for about half an hour for the sperm to get sorted. It's better if you use the inverted microscope to see the sorting of sperm into the microfluidic channel. This is the chamber A where we have dropped the sperm suspension. And this is the laminar flow of the 2 fluids. One is media, another one is sperm. Here you don't see any mixing of both fluids because of the low Reynolds number. This is the junction of C and D where all the sperm undergo positive rheotaxis and migrate again to stream and get sorted out. All good morphology, good DNA integrity. The number where you see all the debris and abnormal sperm reservoir. So finally, after incubation, the sorted sperm can be extracted from the C chamber and it can be used for the procedure.
So what are the technical issues one should look into? Because it looks like, is it a complex procedure? Is it difficult to handle in the lab?
This is basically because as I told you before, here centrifugation is not required. So it's a natural way of selecting sperm. And as I told you before, that microfluidics works on the fluid mechanics and hydrostatic pressure. Two main factors we have to keep it in mind. One is the difference in volume. The exact volume has to be different, and the flow rate. So the media and the sperm suspension should be different carefully and slowly. And that is why I recommend a calibrated pipette should be used in the laboratory to test the exact volume of media and the sperm suspension. And since the slow motion media has got protein in it, there is a chance where we may introduce air bubbles into it. So if air bubbles are introduced into the chamber, the sorting will be poor, and the pressure will increase, and as a result, abdominal sperm can migrate into the sorting chamber actually. So what I recommend is I recommend reverse pipetting is the best solution, where the flow rate will be controlled, the exact volume can be different, and the pressure will be good, and the hydrostatic pressure will also be good. As a result, the sorting will be efficient. So if the pressure is more, definitely the flow rate will be more, and abdominal sperm will be swept away into the collecting chamber, and the sorting will not be efficient. So I recommend the calibrated pipette to dispense exact volume, and reverse pipetting to for flow to be normal. Thank you for
Okay.
listening.
Thank you. Now I request Dr. Sujata and Dr. Nitish to share your experience on the clinical outcome of using microfluidics technology in your centers.
Actually, this microfluidics is a very, very easy technique to establish. In fact, in my opinion, it is much easier than even density gradient centrifugation. And then the second thing is, it is proven beyond doubt that the sperm which is processed through a microfluidic chamber is definitely has lower DNA fragmentation, at least by SCD, and it has been published in several articles now. This is a piece of work from our own laboratory, where actually we had tried it on 66 IVF patients. The meat sample was the assessed DNA fragmentation index by SCD, and the sample actually was separated into two halves. One half was put through density gradient centrifugation, the other half was put through microfluidic chamber. And again, post recovery, we checked DNA fragmentation, and we used a sibling oocyte culture to check the embryology parameters using these two type of processed sperm. And we found that DNA fragmentation actually significantly reduced from the meat ejaculate to the microfluidics group. As you can see, the DNA fragmentation to start with was 36%. Okay, and then by density gradient centrifugation, we could just reduce it by 15 to 15%. But whereas in the MFSS group, the microfluidics group, it went further down to 9.66%. And then we also found an increase in fertilization rate. Our embryo quality was better, and the implantation rate was also found to be better. Now, looking at this data, you might feel that how much is it statistically significant? But I would say that more than statistical significance, I think we were concerned about the clinical significance, because in these days, even if you get one extra embryo for the patient, it's worth it. And for establishing statistical significance, I think we need to do larger number, and that may not be possible in smaller centers. But we found that by using this microfluidics technique, we did not bring down the pregnancy rate. It did not affect our pregnancy rate. In fact, our pregnancy rate went up, our implantation rates went up, and then that actually gave us more embryos for the patients. And eventually, if you are looking at the cumulative pregnancy rate, though we had not calculated it, but this would show that the cumulative pregnancy rate would also improve. And actually, this abstract was presented at ESHRI in 2017. So we are more than convinced that such a simple technique, which does not involve centrifugation, it's very easy to establish in your lab, and then it gives good results.
Okay, thank you very much. Now I request Dr. Nitish, because you also must be having, apart from microfluidics, some other non-invasive or non-centrifugation based techniques for sperm separation in your center. What is your opinion about using these microfluidics?
Yeah, so microfluidic is definitely a very easy technique to use. It is less time consuming. and you don't require an embryologist to do it. A simple embryology technician can also perform it. The only challenge I see is to control the flow rate, as Dr. Arun also mentioned, which requires a bit of technical expertise or training to the person who's doing it. Otherwise, it's a very good technique, and a lot of studies has been done worldwide, which shows that there has been a significant improve in the DNA fragmentation index. Compared to a swim up or a density gradient or even the magnetic types of separation methods used for the sperm. This particular method has shown a significant improvement in terms of the DFI.
Okay. So now let's discuss about the data sharing in a multi-centric setup, because I'm sure with the advancement technology, there's a scope for electronic networking. And do you think data sharing? I'm sure you must have been doing it in your centers. And do you think this is feasible and cost effective? And do you think this is advisable to standalone centers, or I mean, a couple of centers?
Yeah, so I gave a webinar on IoT on cloud-based QC a few days back. So I think the future is basically a cloud-based system, and a lot of people in the industry as well as outside the industry are moving to these kind of systems. So if there is a IoT platform available where you can have your alarm systems being hooked onto it, where all your incubators, your fridge, your cryocans, where the semen samples are being stored, are properly monitored, and if there is any variation, there is an alarm system that comes, and as well as all these measurements of these particular things are logged in automatically, and there is no human intervention involved.
Okay.
The second thing is the electronic witnessing, especially when it comes to sperm. Even if it is used for IUI or IVF, ICSI, or even for a cryopreservation, it is important that you have either a witnessing system or a proper SOP in place with labeling and everything present in your lab. Uh, you can also have a software where all your patient data are stored at the cloud, so you don't have to wait for patient file or look for hard copy documents from your MRD setup. You can just have all the details available at a click, even if it's an old patient. You have all the details available. It becomes easy for you to do detailed analysis. If you want to analyze your patient for last 1 year, it's just available at a click of a button. You can easily do QA QC, which becomes difficult if you have Excel sheets, or if you have those hard copy records available at your clinic. The data management becomes very easy with these cloud-based system, and you can do a lot of research or study specifically based on your patient population in different zones where you're present. You can track your individual andrology as well as embryology KPIs using those systems, where all the data can be put on a BI dashboard, where it tells you how things are being going out of the range which you have defined in your KPI interval. And if you don't have too many images, it is quite cost effective. Cloud is cheaper, these days, and it's getting cheaper and cheaper, with the moving time, and the
Okay.
whole world is shifting from the hardware based system to cloud based system, and it'll
Okay.
definitely
Thank you.
reduce the space which you need to store these extra documentation, as well as people to maintain those documentation, and everything is stored on the cloud and available at a click.
Okay. Thank you very much. Now we have come almost to the end of this panel discussion, but we cannot end without discussing about the COVID, because COVID has made a serious disruption in our profession, in our work. Unfortunately, we know little about this virus, and we really don't know, though there are few reports which have shown that the virus shedding can happen in the ejaculate, but we don't know the virulence of this virus and the biology of this virus, how it can get infect the other samples. So fertility services across the globe are now in the process of restarting, and we have been now I request Dr. Sujatha and Dr. Nitish to share your plan, how you are going to restart your center in this pandemic, and how one should prepare their center.
See, the embryology or the andrology team, okay, has a very limited interaction with the patient compared to the clinical team. So there are two instances where we have to meet the patient. One is during counseling, and two is when you are giving the container and collecting the container back. Now, counseling, as far as possible, we try to do it over the phone, like initiate telecounseling. But whenever it's not possible, try to maintain a physical distance of whatever is recommended, 2 meters, 6 feet distance. And then when you're talking to the patient, wear all the proper mask and PPE is not needed, but gown and gloves ideal. And as I told you earlier, we have to meet the patient to give the container and take the container back. So check if it is possible to ask the patient to collect from home. And again, that has lot of points to be considered. Like you have to find out how long it's going to take for the patient to bring the sample, so on and so forth. But if the patient is collecting there in your own premises, then make some small changes in your protocols, where you don't just take the container by hand. Instead, use a plastic tray or any tray, which is where you ask the patient to leave the container and you take the tray into the laboratory. This tray, along with your container, should be cleaned with some non-toxic disinfectant. Do not use 70% alcohol, because that can actually kill the sperm. And when we are talking about non-toxic disinfectant, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has given a list of disinfectants which can be used in the lab. And you can find quaternary ammonium compounds and even hydrogen peroxide in that list. So, quaternary ammonium compound is something which we use very routinely in the laboratory. So you can use that. Only thing is, be aware of the contact time. It's not enough that you just wipe it and then open it immediately. You have to let the disinfectant sit on the tray or the container for some time before you clean it with a wet towel. Now the sample is brought, and when you're processing the sample, just let one person concentrate on processing one sample. Don't share pipettes or stationary items like pen between the procedures. Finish one procedure and then move on to the next one. Clean up the place, clean up the laminar airflow, clean the test tube racks and all those small piece of equipments in the lab before you move on to the next sample. Then coming to the sperm preparation techniques, though we do not have any direct evidence of any method which is good for samples, even if it is infected with the COVID virus, to get rid of the virus, there is no direct study. But we know that certain methods like double density gradient centrifugation followed by 2 washes actually reduces much smaller virus like HCV virus from the sample. So if it can reduce virus which is of 9 kilobase pairs length, COVID is a larger virus, you can use those techniques to get rid of the virus. I'm telling you again, there is no direct evidence, but most of the things in IVF is extrapolated from other studies. So using that, we can try density gradient centrifugation followed by 2 washes in the lab. Then moving on to sperm cryopreservation, I would say actually the risk is minimal, but still there is some risk. We know that patients infected with viral disease can have virus in their semen sample, and especially influenza virus, the Zika virus is known to be there in asymptomatic patients even for 1 year. So we do not know about COVID virus. We are yet to learn more about it, but still, since the risk is there, try to freeze semen sample in a separate container if it is possible. If you do not have a separate container, at least use a separate canister for storing the cryopreserved semen sample. And then it is also recommended that you remove the seminal plasma, process the sperm, and freeze the sperm pellet. I don't know if I have left anything. Maybe Mr. Nitish can
Sure.
add to it. Yeah.
So, what we have done restarting our clinic is, the normal procedures that other people are adopting to, measure the temperature of all our staff as well as patient coming to the center, fill up a triage form which is a self declaration from them. If they have been in contact with a person who has COVID, or if they have been in a area which is a COVID declared premises or zone. Have they faced any symptoms like fever, cough, cold, flu? In the last 7 to 14 days. These normal questionnaires, all the staff and everything has to. I mean, they have to fill. Second, if your embryology lab has sufficient number of staff, ideally you should divide the staff into two teams and have it on the alternate days coming. So you try to restrict the exposure to the staff with these kind of situations. Um, there have been some reports and some studies which have indicated that some of the severe COVID patients have when the semen was tested, some of them had this COVID found in the semen sample, and there have been some contradicting study also. Since it's a very new thing and not too much research has been done on this subject, it is evidently not clear that if a semen sample has COVID, how much is the probability of transmitting it or infecting the other person. So what we need to do is we need to be careful about this particular aspect. Also, if an embryologist is asymptomatic about this particular, there may be chances of them, transmitting this to the semen sample or even to the oocyte. There have been some studies which were also done which indicated that the presence of COVID in the blood have been found in less than 1% of the patients, right? So when we are dealing with the follicular fluid, again we have to be a bit more careful. Um, what what standard precautions that we are taking in the lab, we should take those precautions, but we need to be careful about using the semen samples in the lab as well as the follicular fluid that we are scanning, because we really don't have too much of a data to justify and to say what the real situation is. And I think with going time, there a lot of people are doing a lot of studies into it, and the situation will be more clear. And of course, we should try to maintain social distancing in the lab. In this particular time when we are trying to double witness a particular procedure, a witness electronic witness system comes in handy, where a single embryologist can do all the kind of situations. In terms of the contamination risk to the media incubator in LN2, of course, since it's less known about the COVID, how can it be airborne? Can it be turned into aerosol and airborne into an incubator or into a media? It is very difficult to say at this particular stage. But it will be highly recommended to use benchtop incubator if you have it available in the lab, and culture single dish in a single box. And in terms of LN2, if you have a separate container, it is advisable to store those particular patients in a separate container, because we still don't know, how COVID can transfer from one particular media to another particular media. So
Okay.
we need to be careful about what we are doing.
Thank you very much. That's a good information. Now we have come to the end of the panel discussion, but we have been getting a lot of questions. Unfortunately, due to lack of time, we cannot take up more questions. Probably, I think we'll take only one question. That is from Miss Joel Bose. Our question is, if the only choice of TISA sample, we have got a sperm with a good morphology of both head and neck, but a minimal movement, and a sperm with some defect in neck piece, but good head morphology and good motility. Which one should be chosen and why? I think Dr. Rahul, would you like to answer this question? Say, look, there's more of physiology here. Because there's a question which I say that there's a sperm which has a neck defect, but good movement. Other one has normal but no very less movement. So do you advise to pick sperm which is having defect in the neck from the physiological perspective, sperm physiology?
Well, Trevor Cooper performed some studies regarding the defects in the neck, but it depends on the defect. Is cytoplasmic droplet what the question is?
No, nothing. That is not clear. But this is just the neck defect. Neck defect. Yeah, but from my point of view, the head defect could be sometimes it could be serious as well. If the problem in the proximal centrioles, then probably it can lead to cleavage arrest and then maybe compromise. And if you see even a minimal motility but head is perfect, I would recommend to pick the sperm with a normal head and with a minimal motility. I don't know if my panelists agree to this, or do you have anything to add to this?
No, I would definitely say, like, if there is a mid-piece defect, I think it is better to avoid that sperm because, like the sperm centrioles definitely has a role to play in the cleavage of embryos. So it is better to avoid sample with the mid-piece defect. But then if it is a cytoplasmic droplet, then and especially if it is a teaser sample, then it might indicate immature spermatozoa. It may not be a serious deformity. It could be just an immature spermatozoa.
Which could also be related to an immature nucleus.
Yes.
I think I agree with all of you. It would be better just to avoid this kind of sperm and select one that is morphologically normal.
Yeah, thank you. So because the time is running, we are running short of time. We cannot take any more questions. We are going to end this panel discussion. I have made a few points, concluding points. It's my responsibility to do that. And based on our discussion, we have understood that the semen analysis has a limited diagnostic value and has a poor prognostic value. And Dr. Rahul has clearly explained there are physiological and biochemical differences in sperm, which makes it difficult to judge the genetic integrity and its functional competence. But there are also recommendations to test DNA fragmentation if there is a history of recurrent implantation failure or the sperm deformities. One can consider rapid, ready-to-use techniques which are simple to perform, good for limited resource setting. And poor quality ejaculate, I think my colleagues have also stated that the poor quality ejaculate have increased susceptibility to experience damage, the genetic or functional damage during lab interventions. Hence, one should consider optimizing the processing technique by optimizing the centrifugation speed, time, and also the handling of the ejaculate. I always like to individualize sperm preparation method rather than going for a very generic protocol for the sample. And among advanced sperm selection methods, Dr. Arun has nicely shown that how microfluidics can help in isolating the competent sperm. And data have also suggested that it can also minimize the DNA fragmentation so that can improve the pregnancy outcome. And finally, with reference to the COVID, we don't know much about the virus, but it is important to consider a safe handling of the ejaculate, equipment use, the liquid nitrogen storage, and more importantly, we should have strategies to take care of people who are working in the lab. So I would like to thank all the panelists for your wonderful discussion and also to attendees for their active participation. Unfortunately, we could not answer their questions. Probably we'll be mailing them later. And once again, thank you very much. Stay safe, stay healthy. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.